Good morning. Welcome to today's webinar on the subject of ISO 45001, 2018, an overview of the changes. My name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. I have a brief agenda on the slide here just to go through what today's webinar will look like. We'll talk a little bit about PJR, who we are, what we do, and then we'll get into some information about the standard. We'll cover some benefits and drivers for certification. We'll talk about the migration timeline for anyone who is migrating from OHSAS 18001 to ISO 45001. We will look at the high-level key changes of the standard compared to OHSAS 18001. And then we'll get into a more detailed clause-by-clause review, focusing on the changes primarily. We will close the presentation with some information about other related changes that coincide to the publication of ISO 45001, as well as providing an overview of the certification process for anyone who would be pursuing certification for the first time and might not be familiar with what that process looks like. And we will save some time for questions at the end. So feel free to type your questions into the chat field, or the question field, excuse me, at any point throughout the presentation. I am going to save those for the end, but again, feel free to type them in whenever you are ready. And we'll utilize that functionality instead of the hand raising. So I see at least one hand raised. If you have a question, go ahead and type that in. If you don't, please go ahead and lower that hand so that we can stay on track. I also want to mention for anyone who may be wondering this, I think we already had a question submitted about this. The webinar today is being recorded, and the recording will be available on PJR's website in the next day or two, as well as a copy of the slides. So the presentation itself via the slides and the webinar recording will both be available for review. You can access them through PJR's website. Okay. So Perry Johnson Registrars is one of the leading registrars in the world. This is not an all-inclusive list, just really quickly put a couple examples of countries in which PJR has certified companies to a variety of standards, just to give you an idea of our global reach. Again, not an all-inclusive list by any means. This is probably pretty outdated at this point. I could make this list a lot longer, I think. But we are, as a registrar, as a certification body, accredited to grant certification for, as I mentioned, a variety of standards, including ISO 45001, which is the subject of today's webinar. There are a variety of benefits of certification for a health and safety standard like ISO 45001, as well as other standards focusing on other subjects. Will focus on the benefits of the ISO 45001 certification. The framework of the standard assists in meeting legal requirements, improving the organization's occupational health and safety performance, and providing a safe environment to do business. There are improvements and benefits related to management commitment and employee engagement. There is improvement to business management factors such as meeting stakeholder requirements, improving public image, achieving strategic objectives, as well as the ability to integrate a health and safety management system like ISO 45001 with other business management systems. There can be improvements and benefits related to supplier health and safety performance, Maintaining a certification such as ISO 45001 can provide a competitive advantage over competitors who may not maintain that same certification. Going through the process of maintaining this management system can minimize the risk of production delays. And also there can be financial benefits beyond the improved public image and competitive advantage we already spoke about. In some areas or in some cases, we have seen cost savings related to insurance liability premiums for maintaining a health and safety certification, just as an example. Again, and that's only in certain areas and certain cases, not necessarily all across the board. ISO 45001 specifically represents a commitment to occupational health and safety and the prevention of injuries and ill health. There is a reduction of risk and hazard for employees, contractors, visitors, etc. There are business management drivers such as improved public image that we discussed on the previous slide. And I also mentioned that the standard represents a framework for identifying and meeting customer and/or regulatory requirements. For anyone who is not familiar, or just a brief overview, ISO 45001-2018 is replacing OHSAS 18001-2007. So that was the predecessor for this ISO 45001 standard in terms of occupational health and safety, and OHSAS 18001-2007 is almost up. They are two different standards. OHSAS 18001 was technically not an ISO standard, which is why we utilize the term migration instead of transition. Technically, a transition would represent going from one revision of the same standard to another, and this is technically a different standard, in case anyone was wondering about that verbiage. The standard defines the requirements for establishing, implementing, and maintaining an occupational health and safety management system, which is commonly abbreviated OHSMS. You'll hear that abbreviation throughout my presentation to save time. A framework that allows an organization to control its hazard, reduce the risks of accidents, injuries, ill health, and/or downtime, and continually improve its processes and operations. So that's really what the standard represents. It was published in March of 2018, and it's a voluntary certification. There aren't regulatory requirements to hold this particular standard. There may be requirements in certain areas to maintain some type of health and safety standard. I don't think that they can specify it needs to be ISO 45001, or you may have a requirement to be certified to the standard by a upstream customer or a supplier, or to be integrated with other standards. However, it's not a regulatory requirement to be specifically certified to ISO 45001, so it is technically a voluntary certification. For clients who are certified to OHSAS 18001 and will be migrating to ISO 45001, there is a 3-year migration period for such certificates based on the publication date of ISO 45001. PJR has already issued a transition plan, and I have the link on this slide with the deadlines that PJR communicated for having your transition audit in order to avoid a lapse of certification and adhere to those deadlines. So specifically, in order to avoid a lapse in certification, there was a deadline communicated, and I have put together a timeline that we'll show on the next slide that really helps understand that information. But the reason for a deadline ahead of the expiration date of all OHSAS 18001 certificates is to make sure that there's enough time to close out your audit package and issue that certificate. It's not sufficient to have your audit conducted before that deadline, because there are other activities that go into issuing a certificate. Package needs to be reviewed by PJR, and that's after any nonconformities have been resolved and closed out through the corrective action process and approved by the auditor. Once the package is closed out and then subsequently approved by a reviewer within PJR, it would go to the certificate department, who would work with the client to ensure that the draft certificate is correct before the final certificate is issued. So that's where that deadline to avoid a lapse comes from. The current recommendation by PJR is that all clients migrate during their regularly scheduled 2020 audits. This would help to not have a overload of clients trying to transition all at once, and ensure that we have the availability of auditors to accommodate these migration audits. The migration audits can occur during a surveillance or a recertification audit. It does not have to occur during a recertification audit. However, there is a requirement to add at least one audit day for the verification of transition requirements to whichever audit you were going to have this migration place during. So whether it's a surveillance audit or a recertification audit, we are required by the 45,001 requirements to add at least one audit day to that time. So as I mentioned, I put together a timeline here. The deadline for all OHSMS 18001 certificates, or the date by which they will all become obsolete if they have not already lapsed, is March 31st of 2021. So that is the deadline that we are working against, again, unless your OHSMS 18001 certificate is already set to expire before that. So our auditors are already trained to the standard. As you can see by this timeline, we are already conducting ISO 45001 audits, and we are no longer providing new registrations to OHSMS 18001. That means that if you are a new client or a new certification, it is no longer possible to obtain certification for the first time to OHSMS 18001. We have passed that deadline already. We are approaching the deadline by which we cannot conduct any OHSMS 18001 audits, which is where the requirement to, or the recommendation to migrate during your regularly scheduled audit this year comes into play. After June 1st of 2020, we can't audit to OHSMS 18001 anymore. And if you have your audit, let's say in May, and you have your audit to OHSMS 18001 instead of ISO 45001, that means you're going to have another audit to migrate sooner than you would normally. Your next audit would have to be scheduled earlier than usual. And not everyone is amenable to those types of changes. So keep this in mind and feel free to discuss this further with your scheduler if for some reason your migration audit hasn't been scheduled yet, or you're curious about your options there. The deadline to avoid lapse in certification is December of this year. Again, that is to be able to ensure that all of those certification making decisions and the package closure activities can be performed by this March 31st deadline. It does take time if you're issued nonconformities during your audit. It takes time to put them through the corrective action process, identify the root cause, potentially implement any action items that were identified through that process, obtain approval of those plans from your auditor, and get that package reviewed. So this is an important slide. Getting into the details regarding the standard itself, as an ISO standard, ISO 45001 reflects the Annex SL structure common to all of the current revisions of ISO standards. So they follow the same format, very similar, if not identical, clause names, and a list of common terms that is shared between those different standards. And these combine to essentially make the standards easier to integrate and ensure that they are easily understood across the board. ISO 45001 also includes a revised Plan, Do, Check, Act model. Compared to OHSMS 18001, there are some changes, so I've included that graphic on this slide, and it can be found within the standard. And this relates to the continual improvement activities of the organization. At a very high level, the key changes between OHSMS 18001 and ISO 45001 include the adoption of the ISO structure, which we discussed on the previous couple of slides, an emphasis on leadership, including accountability, involvement, knowledgeability, and we'll discuss these changes in more detail as we go through the presentation. A focus on risk management, a greater level of emphasis on objectives, measurement, and change. Changes to the communication and awareness requirements. And overall, the standard contains fewer prescriptive requirements to give organizations a greater level of flexibility. There are a variety of changes to the terms and definitions within the standard, and I've included them in the presentation, but we will not be going through these during today's webinar, just to make sure we can finish everything on time. And they are found within the standard, and you can review those either through these slides or with your copy of the standard. So I'm going to go ahead and just click through these. Okay. So I mentioned the higher level changes to ISO 45001. This slide sort of continues that line of thought. There is an increased prominence of occupational health and safety management within the strategic planning process for the organization. Leadership has an entirely new clause in this new ISO Annex SL structure, which assigns specific responsibilities for those in leadership roles to promote the health and safety management within the organization. And we'll get into more detail for this. There is a tone of proactivity throughout the standard. The expectation for organizations has been expanded. Proactively planning and identifying rather than reacting to things that have occurred through a lapse in that process. So protecting the health and safety of workers and interested parties consistent with the context of the organization. And this can include things like the hazard identification process, a risk assessment process, emergency response plans, operational controls, monitoring and measurement, etc. There is also a shift with ISO 45001 compared to OHSMS 18001 in regard to continual improvement. The emphasis is more on improving the health and safety performance of the organization rather than just improving the management system itself. Improving the management system was a bit superficial. The ISO 45001 standard emphasizes improving the occupational health and safety performance of the organization. There is equal emphasis on external and internal communication expectations. That's a bit of a change from OHSMS 18001, so those requirements are broken out separately. And the documentation expectations have been revised. The term documented information is now used. This replaces documents and records and procedures as terms to reflect the changing in, the changes in media, and give greater flexibility to the organization to determine what types of documents or records or procedures would be needed for their processes to be effective, and how they want to maintain that evidence. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as the presentation goes on. We will start with clause 4 to look at the clauses in a little bit more detail where they contain changes. If we are skipping a clause, it means that there is no significant change, or in some cases, I will note that specifically. So for 4.1, understanding the organization and its context, the organization is required to identify, to determine both internal and external issues that are relevant to the management system and its ability to achieve its intended outcomes. The intended outcomes are one of the terms within the standard. It would be worthwhile to review this one. It relates to the organization's ability to avoid incidents and injuries, ill health types of scenarios. So a lot of the requirements in the standard will come back to that definition, or that concept of the organization's ability to achieve its intended outcomes. If a concept or a process doesn't have much impact on that, then it may be of lesser importance regarding the certification compared to the processes or the personnel or the risks and hazards that would have the ability to affect the organization's ability to achieve its intended outcomes. So keep that in mind. A lot of these requirements are as relevant to that concept. 4.2 requires that then the organization determine the relevant interested parties beyond workers and their needs and expectations, which can translate in many cases to requirements. 4.3 requires the organization to consider the issues, both internal and external, identified in 4.1, and those needs and expectations identified through 4.2 when determining the scope of the management system. Clause 5 focuses on leadership and worker participation. As I mentioned, leadership has an entire clause dedicated to it, and this standard really emphasizes the accountability and involvement of top management in pretty specific ways. So we'll take a closer look at that here. Top management, which is defined in the standard and hence underlined in my presentation to draw your attention to that definition in the standard. Top management should, among other things, take on more responsibility for the effectiveness of the OHSMS, the integration of OH&S management into business processes, the adequacy of resources, and the communication of conformance to the OHSMS. So you'll find within the standard a pretty specific list of things that top management is responsible for. And as we'll discuss further in the presentation, they can delegate those responsibilities, but they still retain accountability for the effectiveness of those processes and whether or not those responsibilities have been achieved. 5.2 focuses on the occupational health and safety policy. The policy and the objectives need to be aligned with the organization's strategic objective and achieve the system's intended outcomes. There's that term again. In addition to the pre-existing policy criteria, there is an addition in ISO 45001 to also include a commitment to participation. That would be a change compared to OHSMS 18001. So as I mentioned on the last slide, top management can delegate the responsibilities specified within Clause 5, but they ultimately retain accountability for the management system. Nowhere in the standard is a management representative mentioned. That was a term used in OHSMS 18001 to designate the primary person who holds responsibility for the management system. So that's pretty significant. As I mentioned, the standard really emphasizes the accountability and involvement of top management. So those activities can be delegated to one person or a team of people, but nowhere in the standard does it mention a management representative anymore. It's also a responsibility of top management to make sure that resources are sufficient, that adequate responsibilities and authorities are assigned in order for the management system to achieve its intended outcomes and meet all of the standard requirements. 5.4 focuses on participation and consultation of workers, both of which are defined in the standard document. And in ISO 45001, the criteria for participation and consultation are more specific and prescriptive. So this isn't a new concept. This was in the OHSMS 18001 standard as well, but the verbiage in this standard is more prescriptive. There's a whole list of things that need to be considered, including identifying methods for participation and consultation, any training requirements, any resource needs, etc. Identifying and removing, or minimizing at least, any obstacles to participation. So examples of that may be fear of reprisal, language barriers, a lack of follow through of any feedback received, anything that is discouraging workers from participating in this process. It also emphasizes non-manager participation and consultation in areas such as identification of hazards and risk, operational control identification, incident investigation, determining the needs and expectations of interested parties, determining monitoring and measurement needs, etc. So the idea here is really that there was a trend for the implementation of this participation and consultation concept in the past, and with OHSMS 18001, where it was mostly the managers, the supervisors or the team leaders maybe, who were involved in this rather than the majority of the workers. So the idea being that their work experience, their time spent doing those jobs, those activities, would give them a really helpful perspective in terms of participating in the hazard and risk identification process, or identifying what operational controls might be effective or helpful, giving their insight based on doing those jobs on a daily basis. They should be involved in the incident investigation process when they might have seen what occurred during the incident. They might have observed the incident or had similar instances in the past that they can draw on their experience to share, like I said, their experiences or their expertise, being that that is what they do on a daily basis as part of their job. So something to keep in mind, as this requirement for participation and consultation is really more specific and given greater emphasis in ISO 45001. We're going to be looking as auditors at how you have implemented those processes and whether they are effective. Clause 6 focuses on planning. This entire section has been restructured. There is a consideration for planning and risk determination regarding both positive and negative concepts. So this would be the risks and opportunities when we're talking about positive and negative, any identified issues, and the needs and expectations of interested parties. There's also a focus on achieving those intended outcomes that we spoke about earlier. So we'll look at clause 6 in more detail. 6.1.1 requires the organization determine those risks and opportunities in order to ensure that the management system can achieve its intended outcomes, prevent or at least minimize those undesired effects such as injuries and ill health, and continually improve. Some areas where you might be determining risks and opportunities would be occupational health and safety hazards, legal and other requirements, and any risks and opportunities that can affect the management system's ability to achieve its intended outcomes. So like I mentioned, you're going to see that intended outcomes concept throughout the presentation and throughout the standard. The hazard identification requirements are more prescriptive and call for a higher level of proactivity, as we also discussed earlier. And this relates to the hazard identification process. ISO 45000 requires that this include people in the nearby area who can be affected by the organization, people at the workplace who are not controlled by the organization. Perhaps there is a co-located business and you're sharing workspace. Perhaps there is a temp agency who works in-house and oversees their own people. You have contractors on site perhaps, or visitors. There are considerations for the work area itself, including equipment design, actual or proposed changes that could affect the management system, incidents, etc. So that's just a couple examples, not the full list. 6.1.2.2 requires that the management system have a process to assess occupational health and safety risks, including those relevant to identified hazards and existing controls, with established and proactive criteria. There is a requirement to retain documented information, and as we mentioned earlier, the term for documented information has a lot of flexibility built into it. So you need to have enough evidence within your management system to demonstrate this process has been identified, implemented, maintained, and for us to assess the effectiveness of the process. And whatever the organization determines that looks like in terms of documents or records or anything like that, like I said, there's a lot of flexibility here, but you need to have enough evidence for an audit to be able to assess the implementation and the effectiveness of that process, since the process is required by standard. Similarly, in 6.1.2.3, the standard requires the management system have a process to assess occupational health and safety opportunities relevant to the health and safety performance, including opportunities to improve the work environment, to reduce or eliminate hazards, and/or occupational health and safety risks. So we mentioned that the risks and opportunities combined represent both the positive and negative, and we're looking for both here. 6.1.3 requires the up-to-date determination of and access to any legal and other requirements that are applicable to the organization and the management system. So not only do you need to determine what those requirements are, which requirements apply to the management system, you also have to determine how they apply and how they relate to the organization's hazards and risks. So in other words, it's not just a list citing regulations or copy and pasting the regulatory verbiage. What does that requirement mean to your organization? How does it apply? What does it require you to do? Does it require inspections at a certain frequency, certain incidents be communicated to a certain party within a certain period of time, the posting of certain information in the facility, such as OSHA logs and right to know type information? Does it require certain information be protected, like HIPAA? So those types of considerations, not just what applies, but how those requirements apply. As I mentioned in there could also be communication requirements. So in some cases, you're required to relay certain information within a given period of time, and that can be a regulatory requirement. It can be a permit requirement. You can have communication requirements regarding your local emergency response. Perhaps your local fire department expects to get a copy of your emergency response plan when it changes, or a report of certain types of chemicals that you maintain on site. Those are just a couple examples off the top of my head. So those requirements and how they apply to the organization, including any communication requirements, need to be considered in maintaining and improving the occupational health and safety management system. Legal and other requirements can result in risks and/or opportunities, and you're going to utilize those legal and other requirements and how they apply in building the operational controls, the monitoring and measurement processes, the communication processes, the emergency response processes, etc. Throughout the rest of the standard. This would serve as a framework for the legal and other requirement piece. 6.1.4 requires the planning of action to address risks, opportunities, legal and other requirements, emergency situations, integration, and evaluation of effectiveness. So as I just mentioned, using the legal and other requirements as an example, once you've identified what they are and how they apply, what they require your organization to do, you then need to implement action or plan action to ensure that the organization is able to meet those requirements that you've identified as applicable to the management system. When planning action regarding risks and opportunities, and maybe even emergency situations, you also need to be taking into account the hierarchy of controls, which we'll discuss further in clause 8.1.2, and any system outputs. Six 6.2 focuses on objectives. 6.2.1 requires occupational health and safety objectives to improve the management system and the occupational health and safety performance of the organization. So as I mentioned, that is emphasized in this standard. The clause is specific in things that need to be considered and identified regarding objectives. So the objectives need to be consistent with the occupational health and safety policy. They need to take into account the organization's legal and other requirements, risks and opportunities, and participation and consultation results. They don't necessarily need to reflect all of those things. You don't have to have an objective that addresses each of those items, but they do need to be considered when identifying what objectives would be relevant for the organization. So the objectives need to be monitored and ideally measured if possible. They need to be communicated and they need to be updated as relevant. It's also specific in what needs to be determined and maintained as documented information as evidence of having determined these items for the objectives, and those include actions or tasks to be used to achieve the objective. So how are you going to achieve the objective? What action items or tasks will specifically be required? What are the resource needs? Who is responsible? What is the completion deadline? Are there monitoring methodologies and measurement frequencies identified? How will the results be evaluated to know whether or not the objective has been achieved? And how will this be integrated into the management system? Clause 7 focuses on support. So just at a high level, the competency and awareness requirements are separated into separate subclauses, and the awareness criteria are more prescriptive in ISO 45001. The commitments to occupational health and safety protection are to be given more consideration regarding communication, the external reporting as relevant to the management system needs to be a controlled process. And this is where we find some more detail in the standard about documented information. 7.2 covers competency. The standard requires that the organization determine the competency requirements for workers that can affect the performance of the occupational health and safety management system, and competence must be evidenced through documented information. So here's this caveat again, for workers that can affect the performance of the occupational health and safety management system, very similar to the concept of the ability of the management system to achieve its intended outcomes. So you may have certain workers or competencies for personnel that have little to no impact on the performance of the management system. You may have a majority that have at least a limited impact on the performance of the management system, and you may have some that have quite a bit of impact or potential to impact the performance. So it might be, you know, as relevant to its ability to achieve those items, or you can, you know, you can treat them all the same across the board, assuming that they have a high potential to impact the performance of the management system. That would be up to the organization. Again, you need enough documented information to provide evidence that these competency requirements have been determined. For any action necessary to close a competency gap, if an employee has only part of the competency requirements that are needed for a given role, and action is taken to close that gap, such as providing training, you would also need to evaluate the effectiveness of any actions taken to ensure the competency requirements were met. 7.3 specifies awareness requirements, specific items that the workers need to be made aware of by the organization, including the real or potential ramifications of deviating from the occupational health and safety management system requirements. So this is really a list in the standard in 7.3 of all of the things the organization has to make its workers aware of. So this is really easy to ensure you've hit all of those items by reviewing that list. They're giving you a list. Make sure you incorporate all of those concepts for your awareness process. 7.4 focuses on communication. There's internal and external communication. Internal communication is really not different from OHSMS 18001, so we'll skip that. External communication, this requirement requires the organization to determine the relevant information and any associated communication requirements. Pretty specifically, who is requiring what information be communicated? Is there a deadline or when it needs to be communicated? How is there a preferred method for communication, or anything that communication needs to include? You also need to consider any external interested party views if they're relevant. 7.5 is where you find specific information regarding documented information, including specifying controls within the management system for the creation, the updating, and control of that documented information, whatever the organization deems necessary to meet the requirements of the standard. How is that documented information going to be controlled? Clause 8 focuses on operation. There are not significant changes found within 8.1.1. It's really just planning the actions, making sure they have established process criteria and established processes with sufficient documented information maintained. So this goes back to the concept we've been discussing, where the standard is less prescriptive. It doesn't call out needs to document specific procedures anymore. It gives you a a flexible documented information definition with the caveat that the amount of documented information you implement is sufficient to demonstrate that the processes have been established, the processes that are required by the standard instead of the procedures have been established and are effectively meeting their own criteria as well as meeting the requirements of the standard. There are no significant changes to the hierarchy of controls found in 8.1.2, so we're not going to go through that during today's webinar. We'll assume that you have an understanding of that concept, and you can review 8.1.2. 8.1.3, however, is a new requirement in ISO 45001 reflecting the management of change process. So there was no strong verbiage in OSS 18001 requiring a management of change process. However, it's very clear within ISO 45001 and echoes the call for proactivity. This process is required for controlling planned changes that could affect the occupational health and safety performance of the organization and review and mitigate any negative impacts of inadvertent changes. The idea here really is planning the changes to the system before they're implemented to identify what, if anything, needs to change, what controls are necessary, what training is necessary, what are the risks of this given change, what are the potential outcomes to continue to meet the intended outcomes of the system to ensure no one gets hurt, no one gets sick, things like that. So some examples of when the management of change process might be triggered could include new products, new services or new processes, changing working conditions, adding a shift, for example, moving facilities, changes to equipment itself. If you're installing a new piece of equipment or upgrading an existing piece of equipment, what might change and how might that impact the management system? Any changes to legal and other requirements. Those are just a couple examples. I'm sure there are others. 8.1.4 covers procurement. In general, the clause relates to the outsourced processes and associated controls of those processes being outsourced to make sure that the management system and its performance is not negatively impacted and the requirements of the management system are met even by those outsourced functionalities as relevant. So 8.1.4.2 focuses specifically on contractors. It requires the organization to identify and control occupational health and safety risks related to the activities of contractors. And this could be activities the contractors are doing that could impact the organization's workers or vice versa, the organization's activities and the activities of its workers potentially impacting the contractors that are doing work for the organization. It also requires that there be identified criteria for contractor selection and a process to ensure the contractor activities meet the requirements of the management system. .1.4.3 covers outsourcing, such as procured materials or services. Same idea. Making sure that there's enough control of those processes to make sure that the management system requirements are met and the management system can still achieve its intended outcomes. 8.2 covers emergency preparedness and response. No significant changes. There are a couple additional items to be considered or included in that emergency response process. Some examples include the need to review and revise, if needed, those procedures after drills occur or an actual emergency occurrence, provide any relevant training, including first aid, or identify those training needs, I should say, as well as consider or include the needs and capabilities of all relevant interested parties involved. You can take a look at 8.2 in the standard for some more detail. Clause 9 focuses on performance evaluation. So in terms of monitoring and measurement, the standard requires the management system identify relevant monitoring and measurement requirements. Again, specifically, who is monitoring what, how often, how is that performed, when is it due, those kinds of things, in order to evaluate the performance, the occupational health and safety performance, and the effectiveness of the management system. 9.2 requires internal audits and covers the internal audit program. There are some additional or revised factors to be identified within the audit program found in 9.2.2. It also requires the organization share the results of the internal audit, the outputs of the internal audits, with relevant managers, workers, and/or their representatives, and any other interested parties that would be relevant. So anyone who might need that information, the standard requires that it be shared with them or available to them. Clause 9.3 covers management review. There are some changes and additional items to the inputs and outputs list in this section. So again, this section is specific. It's telling you exactly what inputs and outputs are required, and you should be using this as a framework for those meetings or getting a basis for your process of what will be covered, because if you miss any of those items, that's a pretty easy nonconformity to identify, kind of low-hanging fruit for auditors. So if the standard is giving you a list of criteria or inputs and outputs, make sure you're incorporating all of those requirements into your process. And as a reminder, the management review needs to be performed by top management. So again, the standard really emphasizes the involvement of top management. The management review tool is really powerful in making sure that top management, through their requirement to be involved in management review, is aware of what it takes to run the system, the resource needs, how it's doing, the effectiveness of the management system, the outputs of those audits, how things are going, the incident rates, whether it's meeting the intended outcomes or not. This is a really important tool required by the standard. So make sure that top management is involved as required according to that top management definition in the standard. The last clause is clause 10. It focuses on improvement. In general, it requires continual improvement, including opportunities for improvement, which can be found in clause 9 and are not necessarily included in all of the other ISO standards. Opportunities for improvement are included in ISO 45001. The clause 10.2 focuses on incidents, nonconformities, and corrective actions. Specifically, some of the changes here really specifically requiring timely action to address or correct any incidents or nonconformities. It's not appropriate to sit on these, to put the investigation off, or to have a root cause analysis that's sitting out for a couple of months, or a planned correction that just does not get implemented in a timely manner. This is an important concept, especially for an occupational health and safety management system. Corrective actions need to be reviewed for effectiveness and have documented information as evidence sufficient to demonstrate that those requirements have been met. And it requires, similarly to the internal audit, that the results be reported to relevant workers and/or representatives and any other interested parties that would be relevant. 10.3 requires continual improvement of the management system through performance improvements, maintaining a culture that supports the management system, participation of workers in implementing controls that drive improvements, communicating the results, and maintaining documented information as evidence of those improvements that have been implemented. The standard also includes Annex A, which contains some guidance information on how to specifically utilize the document. That's not auditable, but it can certainly serve as a helpful resource for an organization who is implementing the standard. And there's also a bibliography, neither of which we'll be going through today. In relation to the publication of ISO 45001, there were also two IAF mandatory documents focusing on occupational health and safety and or the migration of clients from OHSMS 18001 to 45001. Most of these requirements are for the certification bodies, but a couple of the requirements trickle down to clients that I want to just include in the presentation here and share some of them very briefly. They contain requirements for organizations to notify their certification body's program manager in writing. So take a look at the significant change definition for ISO and make sure that you have a communication mechanism to recognize when they occur and communicate them to the appropriate parties. It's not sufficient to wait until your next audit and share it with your auditor once they get on site. It can cause a bunch of issues. So make sure you have a process adequate to respond to significant changes. There is a prescribed audit timetable that we are required to use. It's not something that PJR creates to determine how long your audits are. It's based on risk level and employee count, and time in general does go up compared to OHSMS 18001. There is an increase in audit time related to the requirements of ISO 45001 that we're required to utilize. Top management involvement and accountability is stressed throughout the standard to the point where these IAF mandatory documents require our auditors to document the absence of top management from the closing meeting. So they have to document the excuse as to why top management, a member of the top management team, may not be in attendance for the closing meeting. And this is really to further emphasize this requirement. Again, this is coming from these mandatory documents. We may need to conduct special audits related to legal compliance violations or complaints or incidents, and this is found in the terms and conditions already. And certain types of compliance gaps may prevent initial certification until you can get your arms around them and demonstrate that that process is effective. We may not be able to provide initial certification if you've already got an outstanding compliance situation going on. Overall, the requirements of these standards, very similarly to ISO 45001, raise the bar as to the performance expectations of an occupational health and safety management system. Okay, so just to wrap this up, for anyone who is pursuing certification to ISO 45001 and they haven't gone through the certification process, really briefly, this is what that process entails. So you'll need to establish the system documentation that meet the requirements of the standard, conduct any training that's required by the management system, implement those management system requirements, those communication requirements, the emergency response requirements, including their internal audit, the compliance evaluation, which we didn't specifically cover in this webinar. It didn't change from OHSMS 18001, and the management review, which should include the outputs of the internal audit in that review. You'll also need to have a contract with a certification body such as PJR to conduct your audits. Initial certification would consist of a stage 1 audit and a stage 2 audit, and you would need to address any nonconformities that resulted from that stage 2, if you received any, before a certificate could be issued. The stage 1 audit is a documentation review to make sure the documentation framework is in place and meets the requirements of the standard, to make sure that you're ready to move on to the stage 2 phase. The stage 2 audit is a full system audit of the entire management system. All of the processes, all of the shifts, all of that would be sampled. You could receive nonconformities if you are found out of compliance or out of conformance with the standard requirements or your own requirements if you're not doing what your documentation framework or your documented information, your processes require. You would resolve any nonconformities, and then you would be issued a certificate, which is good for 3 years, and placed on the surveillance audit cycle accordingly. You can have annual or semi-annual audits based on your preference and your contract, and those would be partial system audits. Unlike a stage 2, we don't cover all of the processes and all of the shifts. It would be a sampling, roughly half. Each of those surveillance audits would cover about half of the system, followed by the recertification audit during that 3rd year of the cycle, which is very similar to the stage 2 in that it's a full system audit and results in an issuance of a new certificate once any nonconformities are resolved. And so the cycle would continue from there. I have a couple slides in here about multi-site certifications and integrations. We're running a little behind schedule today, so I'm going to go ahead and skip through those. This would be something that you would discuss with your salesperson and your scheduler, and I can answer any questions offline if you have questions about how this applies and whether your integrated system is eligible for any time discounts. So if you have not already, go ahead and type any questions you have in the questions field, and I'm going to put my contact information up on the screen here. So again, my name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. We also have an EHS Program Manager that you can contact. Her name is Stacy DeSantis. I have her email address on the screen, and we can both be reached through PJR's main number. I've also included the sales department contact information for anyone who is looking for a quote or to get that process started contracting with Perry Johnson, know what your audit length might look like or something along those lines. We can help you with that as well. So let's see what, if any, questions we have. Okay, the first question, are there any common sticking points that you're seeing when companies are making the transition from OHSAS 18001 to ISO 45001? So I'm assuming by sticking points you mean common nonconformities or some trends in issues. I would say obviously focusing more on the changes. We're not seeing too many issues with the pre-existing OHSAS 18001 requirements. I would say management of change, maybe not being implemented in full or triggered whenever there is a relevant change. Since this was not required in OHSAS 18001, it tends to be a less formal process, maybe not utilized to its full extent. I would also say the leadership piece is going to take some time. In some organizations, it's a pretty significant shift away from one management representative responsible for everything, reporting to top management, trying to get them to understand the importance of the system, how they can support it, how the resources are insufficient, to having top management really be knowledgeable and accountable. And this varies a lot by organization, by size, by those specific top management team members, but that would be an area where we do see some issues at this time. And maybe the concept of documented information, the idea that suddenly, they're not required as an organization to document as much, but the requirement to have that process is still there, and you have to have enough evidence that that process is determined. All of those criteria have been determined, and sometimes it's pretty challenging to have that evidence without some types of documentation. So the evidence has to be sufficient to have to show an auditor that you've determined and the process meets all of the requirements specified in the standard, and for us to evaluate the effectiveness of that process in both meeting the requirements of the standard and meeting the requirements of the process itself. So similar to in OHSAS 18001, if you have a documented procedure, we would audit the process against both the standard requirements and the requirements specified in the procedure. Are you doing what you say you'll do? And that can be a bit challenging with this more flexible documented information definition if there's not enough evidence within the management system. So off the top of my head, I would say that those are a couple, not an all-inclusive list, but that would be a couple things that I can think of. So we have another question. Could you send a list for minimum records required to check in ISO 45001 audits? I really can't actually, again, with the documented information definition written the way that it is, we can't provide that. It's really up to the organization to determine what evidence is needed or in what format the documented information will be maintained. So that's kind of tricky to answer. You can review the verbiage of the standard anywhere, if anywhere. I have to look at it. If there's any mention of documenting a process versus maintaining documented information, the need to document something instead of just saying, like I said, documented information would indicate something would need to be documented. Other than that, it's really up to the organization. So I would just review the standard. You can also perhaps review the annex for more information. If you're an organization looking to implement the standard, the annex might be able to clarify. Again, the annex is not auditable, but it does provide guidance for the understanding of the standard requirements, maybe clarify some things and give perhaps some examples of how to implement those requirements. We have one last question. Is ISO 45001 designed to replace both 18001 and ISO 14001? No. ISO 45001 is specifically the Occupational Health and Safety Management System standard, which replaces OHSMS 18001. ISO 14001 is a completely different subject. It is an ISO standard, but it covers the environmental management system requirements. So it does not replace ISO 14001. The current revision of ISO 14001 is the 2015 version of the standard, and that is not being replaced by ISO 45001 at all. It'll just be OHSMS 18001, which eclipses March 31st of next year. Okay, I don't see any other questions. Feel free to reach out to me offline, but thank you for your questions and attending today's webinar. If you have not migrated already, I hope this information is helpful, and good luck on your upcoming migration audit. Feel free to reach out to me via email or phone if you have any questions that I can help you with. Otherwise, like I said, good luck with your transition and have a great day.